Gaudete, gaudete, Christus es natus, ex Maria Virgine gaudete.
Welcome to the Rediscovery channel. This is the channel where I, Ivor Kovac, and my good friend Stilgar take turns coming up with topics from history that the other person doesn't know about and often hasn't heard about. And today it is my turn, and I'm going to ask Stilgar, have you heard of Amenemhat I?
Can you say that again? Sorry, the name?
Amenemhat I.
No, is that some kind of Egyptian pharaoh or?
That's
Sorry.
correct.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, it is a very Egyptian sounding name.
Yes. Yeah.
And actually, what his name means is a moon is in front. A moon is
Okay.
in front. Yeah.
Yeah.
And a moon is kind of interesting because he's the Egyptian god who is kind of credited as being the creator of the universe. He's also called the Great Honker because he honked like a goose and the whole universe came into existence by that. So it's kind of interesting. And by picking names like this, you're kind of trying to protect yourself, invoke the blessings of the god, or do it on behalf of your kids. Um, but Amenemhat the first is, of course, not the only one. That's why we call him the first. But he's the founder of the 12th Dynasty, as well as the first king of the Middle Period, the Middle Kingdom period of ancient Egyptian history. So he ruled for about 29, maybe 30 years. Different sources give different lengths to his reign. And of course, we don't have a birth date for him. It makes it kind of tough to really know the ancient Egyptian chronology. There's different estimates for when these guys lived and ruled. Yeah, there's different estimates, and there's a margin of error of decades, maybe centuries. So it's kind of tough. But we do know some things about his life. Like we know for sure that he is the founder of the 12th dynasty, and supposedly, so that I have two estimates here of his period of rule. One gives the years 1937 to 1908 BC, and another is 1939 to 1910 BC. And it could be that neither of them is actually right. These are just estimates based on certain assumptions. But we do know that the length of his reign is given as 29 or 30 years. And supposedly, he actually started his career working as the vizier under Mentuhotep. And Mentuhotep was the last pharaoh of the 11th dynasty. So he's coming out of, I believe, the first intermediate period. So the Old Kingdom the Old Kingdom period of Egypt was the time when the Great Pyramids were built, as well as the Djoser complex, which was the first pyramid that we talked about in the Imhotep video, which is still around. So the Old Kingdom pyramids, where nobody knows how exactly they were made. People have theories, but nobody really knows. Um, they were made out of solid stone blocks. And that's why they're still around today. And they were so well built that no mortar was required. And like the Great Pyramid of Egypt, you could not even fit a piece of paper between those stones because they're so well cut. Of course, later on, the exteriors were stripped off and used for other things. But that was the time of Egyptian history when the best pyramids were built. And then you had something happened. I'm not really sure what. I could investigate if our viewers are interested. But there was a period of transition, which is called the first intermediate period. And when it was over, we come to the Middle Kingdom period. I keep wanting to say pyramid, but the Middle Kingdom period beginning with Amenemhat I. So Amenemhat started his career as vizier, supposedly, or at least there's a record of an Amenemhat serving as the vizier under Mentuhotep. And after Mentuhotep dies, Then Amenemhat I becomes the pharaoh. And what he does is he moves the capital away from Thebes to a place called Itij Tawi. All right, so just read some of his accomplishments here. So he built fortresses after he unified the country. He built fortresses to protect the eastern and western frontiers and to guard the delta. He added to the Temple of Amun that was at Thebes and built some other sites. And he also resumed the practice of building pyramids. Although the original methods used in the Old Kingdom were lost, and the pyramids that were built during the Middle Kingdom period were actually built out of bricks made with straw. Some of them, I believe, were actually surfaced with stone, but mostly they were made out of bricks. And so they aren't nearly as well preserved or as nice looking as the Old Kingdom pyramids. But this guy, he took some inspiration from the good old days, basically, I guess, trying to make Egypt great again, and resumed the practice of building pyramids. And his pyramid was built at Al-Lisht. He had a son named Sesostris I, and this guy, he made him into his co-regent in the 20th year of his reign. So that's significant because it begins, this is where the practice of the co-regency begins in Egypt with Amenemhat I and Sesostris I. And it was considered a little bit controversial, supposedly, because the pharaoh is connected with divinity. He's a representative of the gods. And in some of the ancient literature, as well as tomb inscriptions, one of the descriptions I see for pharaohs is the perfected god. So it's almost so the ancient Egyptian culture, you know, it was kind of a fusion of church and state. The pharaoh is also the supreme religious authority as well as the supreme secular authority. Sesostris, his first assignment is, or one of them, is to deal with the Nubians, because the Nubians were kind of a perennial problem for the Egyptians, a thorn in their side. And Sesostris, while he is co-regent, he conquers Nubia as far south as the second cataract of the Nile. And then in the year 29, or in the 29th or 30th year of his reign, Amenemhat I is assassinated. And when he's assassinated, his son Sesostris is out fighting in Libya against the Berbers that are there, and he has to come back and solidify his claim to the throne. And it looks like Amenemhat was assassinated in the palace. So what I'd like to do now is go over some of the literature that's associated with the death of Amenemhat I. And the first thing I want to look at is called The Teaching of King Amenemhat. Not going to read all of it, but I'll read some of it. And this was not written down by Amenemhat. It was actually written after he was dead. It was written by, supposedly, it's believed to have been written by a scribe named Keti. And it's advice for the new king that's taking over. So I'll start at the beginning and then I'll stop here at a certain point. So, beginning of the teaching made by the majesty of the dual king Mentuhotep, the son of Re, Amenemhat the Justified, when he spoke in a revelation to his son, the Lord of all. He said, Rise as a god. Listen to what I tell you, that you may be king of the land and rule the banks, increasing the good. Concentrate against subjects who prove non-existent, in whose respect no faith can be placed. Do not approach them when you are alone. Trust no brother, know no friend. Make for yourself no intimates. This is of no avail. You should sleep with your own heart watching over you, for a man will have no supporters on the day of pain. I gave to the beggar, I raised the orphan, and I made the man who had not end up like someone who had. It was someone who ate my food who caused trouble. Someone to whom I had given my help was raising plots with it. Someone clad in my fine linen was looking at me as if needy. Someone anointed with my myrrh was pouring water in return. So I want to comment on a few things here. First of all, basically what the gist of this is saying is that he is too nice. One of the character flaws of Amenemhat is that he cares too much. He's talking about that he gave them myrrh and they pour out water in return. And the second thing is, if you notice the rhyming structure is similar to kind of what you would read in Psalms and Proverbs. So, based on what I've seen, the Egyptians and the Hebrews, they used the same kind of rhyming scheme, which it doesn't rhyme in the way that we think of rhyming in Indo-European cultures, where it's the sounds of the words that rhyme, with the previous line or with every other line. Here, the way that they rhyme is by concept. And it's actually, if you think about it, a stronger way of writing poetry, because even though this is translated into English, the rhyme scheme doesn't get lost because it's based on the content rather than the phonetics. Whereas if you translate Dante or into English, for example, the rhyme scheme is destroyed. If you want to do a direct translation, you can jigger it around a little bit and change it somewhat and then make it rhyme again. Like that's what John Ciardi did when he translated the Inferno. But in general, with stuff like this, you can translate it directly. The rhyme scheme is untouched. So um, I'll keep going a little further. Oh, my living images, my partners among men, make for me mourning such as was never heard before, the great fighting such as was never seen before. When one fights in the arena, forgetful of the past, the goodness of someone who ignores what should be known is of no avail. It was after supper when darkness had fallen, and I had spent a happy time. I was lying on my bed since I was tired, and my heart had begun to follow sleep. When the weapons at my disposal were wielded, I had become like a worm of the necropolis. As I came to, I woke to fighting, and I found it was an attack of the bodyguard. If I had quickly taken weapons in my hand, I would have made the back turners retreat with a charge. But no one is strong in the night. No one can fight alone. No success will come without help. So here, what he means by back turners. What do you think that means, Stilgar?
I don't know. I mean, literally, back turner means if you turn your back on somebody, right? I mean,
You
I don't
think
know.
it's yeah. Literally, that's how we would think, right? Um, but it's actually a colloquialism. It doesn't have to do with running away in fear. And I had to look at the notes to understand this, but basically he's calling them it's their way of describing somebody who likes to take it in the backside. So gays, basically. That's what he's the people that I know, right? They turn their back and then they take it. That's what this means, actually.
Oh, okay, all
So
right.
it was a colloquialism
Even back
to
then, huh? That's I didn't know. Okay.
yeah, and I thought that was interesting, of course, because in the Greek literature they don't have as much of a problem with this. The Greeks, they were okay with the gay, but it looks like
Yeah, only in certain cases, they had rules around it. So
yeah, looks
yeah.
like the Egyptians were not as okay with it. They used it as a disparaging term, and here it's used to um, insult traitors and enemies of the state.
Mm.
So yeah. Um, okay, so here's a little bit more of what he said, and then I'm going to stop here. So I strode to Elephantine. I traveled to the marshes. I stood firm in the limits of the land, having seen its midst. I attained the limits of strength with my strong arm and my manifestations. I was a maker of grain, beloved of Nepri. The Nile flood honored me on every plain. No one hungered in my years, no one thirsted then. Men could relax through what I had done and told of me. All that I decreed was as it should be. So I supposedly, there's some people think there's some evidence to indicate there was some political turmoil when Amenemhat came to power, and I saw some speculation about that he may have actually had something to do with the death of Mentuhotep, but that's just speculation. There's no evidence for it really, no concrete evidence. So if you ask me to kind of, if you ask me what I think that the reason that Amenemhat implemented the co-regency is because Mentuhotep died without having somebody that was trained in order to take over. And it looks like in the long run, Amenemhat was right to do so because he got killed before his reign was over. So he started his son as the co-regent, giving him some work to do, managing things, people taking orders from him. And again, there's still a vizier. That's a different thing. But he started this process and it brought some stability to Egypt and to the regime. There's another story that was written. It's a very famous story. And it was popular in Egypt for centuries after it was written. It's called the Tale of Sinuhe. Might be pronouncing this guy's name wrong. It may or may not be a true story, but this is a story about a courtier who was working for the the dynasty. He was working for Amenemhat, and he was actually on a campaign with his son, Sinusret, or Sesostris. I've seen his name written different ways, but Sesostris, he was on the campaign in Libya when his father was killed, and of course he had to turn and go back around. So this is a story that was written about this from the perspective of a courtier, and it became very popular and remained very popular as a piece of literature that people would read for entertainment. So I'll read some of it. I'm not going to read all of it. Okay. The patrician and count, governor of the sovereign's domains in the Syrian lands, the true acquaintance of the king whom he loves, the follower, Sinuhe says, I was a follower who followed his lord, a servant of the royal chambers, and of the patrician lady, the greatly praised, the queen Sinwo-sret in Knemusut, and the princess of Amenemhat in Nefru, the blessed lady. Regnal year 30, month 3 of the inundation, season day 7. So here, according to this tale, Amenemhat I did rule for 30 years. So, the god ascended to his horizon. The dual king Mentuhotep IV mounted to heaven and was united with the sun. The divine flesh mingling with its creator, the residence was in silence, hearts were in mourning. The great portal was shut, the entourage was bowed down, and the patricians were in grief. Now his majesty had sent out an expedition to the Libyan land with his eldest son at its head, the perfected god Sinwosret. But now he was returning, having carried off Libyan captives and all sorts of cattle without number. The friends of the court sent to the western border to inform the prince of the affair which had happened in the audience hall. So here it looks like he was killed in the throne room, but in the other one we read, it says that he was killed while he was in bed, while he was sleeping. On the road, the messengers found him. They reached him at nightfall. Not a moment did he wait. The falcon flew off with his followers. So that's Sinwosret. Sometimes his name is written Sinwosret, sometimes Sesostris. So it's the same guy. Without informing his expedition. Now, when the royal children accompanying him on the expedition were sent to, one of them was summoned. Now, when I was standing on duty, I heard his voice as he spoke. As I was a little way off, my heart staggered. My arms spread out, trembling fell on every limb. I removed myself, leaping to look for a hiding place. I put myself between two bushes until the traveler had parted from the road. So, Stilgar, why do you think this guy is so afraid?
I don't know.
Okay, so we know that he is a courtier, right? And he's
Yeah.
on the military campaign with the heir, who's also a co-regent.
Mm-hmm.
So in the ancient world, what happens when, well, first of all, why is it that, in the most basic level, why is it that kings are killed and queens?
Because somebody else wants to take over.
Exactly. And what happens when the new person takes over?
They kill all their loyal people and family.
That's right. They're gonna kill the supporters, or at least remove them from positions of power. So that's why this guy is freaking out, basically. And also, one of the things I forgot to mention earlier, when Amenemhat came to power, one of the things he did was fill positions with his supporters. And it may also have been why he moved the capital in the first place, was to get away from uh, people in the previous regime, to get away from the corruption, maybe. I mean, that doesn't mean that he killed Mentuhotep, but it could have been that the people that killed Mentuhotep also tried to kill Amenemhat. So let's keep going. I traveled southwards. I did not plan to reach this residence. That's where the pharaoh lives, expecting strife would happen. I did not think to live after him. I went across Lake Mati in the region of the Sycamore. I came to the Isle of Sneferu. I passed the day on the edge of a field. When it was daylight, I made an early start. I met a man standing in my way. He saluted me, though I was afraid of him. When it was supper time, I had arrived at Cattle Quay. I crossed in a rudderless barge. Blown by the west wind, I passed east of Iaku, above Lady of the Red Mountain. I gave my feet a northward path, and I reached the walls of the ruler, made to beat back the Syrians. I crouched down in a bush for fear of being seen by the watcher on duty upon the wall. I traveled in the night time. When it was drawn, I reached Pitan. I alighted on an island of Kimur. Thirst's attack overtook me, and I was scorched. My throat parched. I said, "This is the taste of death." But I lifted up my heart and gathered my limbs together as I heard the noise of cattle lowing, caught sight of Syrians and a leader of theirs who had once been in Egypt. Then he gave me water while he boiled milk for me. I went with him to his tribe, and what they did was good. Country gave me to country. I set out for Byblos. I got to Kedem. I had spent half a year there when Amenenchi carried me off. He was the ruler of Upper Retniju, and he told me, "You'll be happy with me, for you'll hear the speech of Egypt." He said this knowing my character and having heard of my understanding, and the Egyptians who were with him there had vouched for me. So, what ends up happening, and I'm going to summarize. I'm not going to read this whole thing, but I will read one more piece of it. Uh, the area of Retniju is Canaan, roughly. It's that area. And what ends up happening is he gets taken in by this guy, Emunenshi, who's a tribal chief, some group of Canaanites, and he makes this guy like a deputy and marries him to his daughter, and he oversees property for the chief, managing animals. It doesn't say he tended the animals or anything like that, because the Egyptians, they considered tending animals to be kind of low work or dirty work. But he gets cattle and men assigned to him, and he rules and governs on behalf of this guy, part of his territory, and is very successful. And then eventually there's another Canaanite who comes to fight with him. And I do want to read this part because it's interesting for cultural purposes. All right, here we go. A hero of Retniju came to provoke me in my tent. He was a peerless champion who had subjugated all the land. He said he would fight with me. He planned to rob me. He thought to plunder my cattle on the advice of his tribe. That ruler conferred with me. I spoke thus: "I do not know him. So am I some ally of his to walk around in his camp? Or does this mean that I've opened his private quarters, overturned his stockade? It is resentment at seeing me do your missions. How like am I to a bull of roaming cattle in the midst of another herd, whom the bull of that little herd attacks, whom that long-horned bull is charging? Can an inferior ever be loved as a superior? No barbarian can ever ally with a Delta man. What can establish the papyrus on the mountain? Does that bull want to fight? Or does that champion bull want to sound a retreat in terror of being equal? If he does, if he has the will to fight, let him speak his wish. Does God not know what he has fated? Or does he know how it stands? When it was night, I strung my bow and tried my arrows, sharpened my sword and polished my weapons. When it was dawn, all Ret Niju has come, having incited its tribes and gathered its neighboring countries. For it had planned this fight, and yet every breast, and yet every breast burned for me. The wives jabbered, and every heart was sore for me, saying, Is there another man mighty enough to fight him? Then his shield, his axe, his armful of javelins fell to me. After I had escaped his weapons and made them pass by me, with his arrows spent in vain, one after the other, he approached me and I shot him. My arrows stuck in his neck. He cried out and fell on his face. I felled him with his own axe and gave my war cry on his back while every Asiatic was bellowing. So, I thought this part was kind of interesting, and the reason I read it is because you can see him smack talking about this guy, where he says, that the papyrus is written on the mountain. So he is referring to the fact that he has one of the advantages he has is that he's literate, and these people are not. Um, and then what happens is he gets old and he wants to go back to Egypt so that he can have a proper burial. But of course, he's still kind of afraid. And since eventually he gets a letter from Sesostris, who's the new pharaoh, and he says, "Yes, you can come back." Um, and he comes back, and when they see him, they say, "Oh no!" They welcome him back, but then they say, "Oh no, he looks like an Asiatic." And so they shave his beard and they clean him up and put him in some better clothes, and then he lives out his days, and he's buried in a pyramid, given a proper burial. And that was one of his concerns while living among the Canaanites, is that, I'm not going to get a proper burial while I'm here with these people. So I read that, I thought it was interesting. Um, and another thing is that is kind of, well, by our standards today, we would consider it to be kind of gross, is that Sesostris, or Sinwasret, he marries his sister. And, they're the bloodline. And actually, that's something that happened over and over again with the Egyptian dynasties, is they did marry siblings, and then they end up, the dynasty ends up failing eventually because of um, the genetic problems that make them less healthy. Um, any rate, any questions? Or I think that's all I need to cover about this, or all that I really want to cover. But I thought it was interesting, because the way that this story of Sinuhe reads, it kind of reminds me of Edgar Rice Burroughs' story. The way he's dodging arrows and everything, and then he takes the guy out. But you can see, um, from this story what the Egyptians, they think, they have kind of a dim view of the cultures that live to the east of them. Like in Genesis, it talks about how every shepherd is an abomination to the Egyptians. You can definitely see that. I mean, in the way that they talk about them in some of these works from the 12th Dynasty, which I've been reading. I have a book, if anybody's interested. It's called The Tale of Sinuhe and Other Ancient Egyptian Poems. I'll put it in the description below, and I'll put a picture of it if anybody wants to read it for themselves. It's a good insight into the culture, and it's interesting for historical purposes as well. I mean, when it comes to the death of Amenemhat, mainly what we know about it comes from these two things that I read: the Tale of Sinuhe and the wisdom of King Amenemhat. The wisdom of King Amenemhat, the setting or it's supposed to be like he's talking to his son from the dead, but of course it was written by a scribe. But yeah, that's all I've got. You want to add anything, Stilgar?
No, I can honestly say I knew nothing of this topic whatsoever. So, yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting how the Egyptians and also the Ipuwer papyrus, which I mentioned, is included in this book. And the reason that we have some of these texts is because there was some people that arranged to be buried with their favorite books, because the Egyptians, they believed that you can physically take stuff with you to the next life. Of course, there were quite a few copies made of the Tale of Sinuhe. The oldest copies date date towards the end of the 12th Dynasty. The original, we don't have, of course. Most of the ancient texts, they're copies of copies of copies. So expecting to find the original first handwritten copy of anything is an extremely high bar. Originally written during the time of probably Sesostris or Senwosret. It gets kind of confusing how these names are rendered. At one point he's called this, and someplace else he's called that. But yeah, that's we actually have their afterlife beliefs, which of course we don't share, but to thank for these texts being preserved, because this guy wanted to be able to have stuff to read when he went into the next life. And of course he can't read it in the next life, but we can now that he's dead. So yeah, did you notice anything else about this story, Stilgar, about the Tale of Sinuhe? Sounded familiar to you?
No, but that's probably because of me being illiterate.
Who else went to who can you think of anybody that ran away from Egypt and went to live in the Middle East and married the daughter of a chieftain?
Moses?
Yes, yes, yes. And of course, we'll talk about this more later, but the time around when Moses would have been around, this book was the story was being circulated among the upper classes. It was a popular story. So I don't think obviously that Sinuhe is Moses, but I do think that Moses read this story, and that was a factor in his decision-making process on where he would go and maybe what he was expecting his future to be. Sinuhe, he returns to Egypt and recovers his status and everything, and gets the kind of ending that he wants. And of course, the ending for Moses is different, but yeah, man, it's interesting. And I'm still reading more of this literature. I have lots of stuff that I'm reading, and I would just encourage all of our viewers to read books.
Put some links in the description of the video, so maybe people can get inspired and read the same book.
Yeah, I don't know if this is available in digital form. I guess it could be. I actually ordered this, I think, from Barnes and Noble. It's an Oxford classic. But if you get this book, you'll get all these stories, the Tale of Sinuhe, the Wisdom of Amenemhat, the Ipuwer Papyrus, which I talked about earlier. And there's a bunch of other things here. Like there's um, the Tale of King Cheops' Court, which was also written during the 12th Dynasty, most likely. But it was written about an earlier period during the Old Kingdom period, which they kind of had a high view of. They admired, I mean, who doesn't admire a glorious past? But yeah, so I guess if there's no questions or if there's nothing else, we can go ahead and close this one off. So thank you guys for listening. And if you made it to the end, congratulations. Do leave us some comments, and any questions or feedback is welcome, including negative feedback. And other than that, I will see you guys in the next one.
Deus homo factus est natura mirante, unus renovatus est a Christo regnante. Gaudete, Christus est natus, ex Maria Virgine, gaudete.